If you've got a Bible with you, go ahead and go with me to the book of Acts. Acts chapter 17 is where we're going to be this morning. If you don't have a Bible with you and you'd like to follow along, if you search around in one of the chair racks in front of you, you should be able to find one. And we are going to be on page 926 of those Bibles that are in front of you. As far as the page number is concerned in your own Bible, I can't help you on that one. You're going to have to be on your own, but you've got a table of contents. Find where we're at. Acts chapter 17 is where we're going to be. Good morning. It's good to see all of you this morning. It's good to sing the good news of the gospel together and pray the good news of the gospel together. And now, God willing, we are going to preach and hear God's word, the good news of the gospel and God's word together. You're well aware of this, but technology is constantly evolving and advancing. Innovations in technology is what make that little phone in your pocket smaller, faster, smarter, and more capable this year than it was last year, and more capable certainly than it was several years ago. I saw an article on a tech blog of a girl who decided that she, this past year, she found her original iPhone in a box in her closet, and she decided she was going to try out what it was like to go back to the original iPhone. And so she was going to, I think she was going to try to go for a whole month using the original iPhone, but after a week she gave up because the original iPhone, technological advance that it was now so totally lame that it could not do any of the things that she was accustomed to doing. A lot of the apps that she used no longer worked with the iPhone anymore. That's technology innovating with each passing year. But there are some kinds of technology where the term innovative is insufficient to describe the advances that particular piece of technology makes. There is some technology which is referred to as disruptive technology. And it's referred to as disruptive technology because it does not merely innovate. It does not merely make your phone or your TV or your computer or whatever a little bit better or even a lot better than the one that was the year before. Disruptive technology doesn't just innovate, it turns everything upside down. Disruptive technology doesn't make your phone better, it invents entirely new ways of communication. And I read an example of disruptive technology as it relates to the auto industry in a Forbes article that was about self-driving electric vehicles. Now, you know that we all the time we read articles about what the future is going to be like. We watch movies about what the future is going to be like. And, you know, a movie looks 10 years into the future and it's like totally different. And 10 years into the future actually is not that different. So I don't know if this kind of thing will actually happen. But they talked about the future where technology enables self-driving electric vehicles, which means that you and I no longer own an automobile. Now that seems almost un-American because we have a love affair with the car. We put cars in movies. We've got posters of cars. Cars are status symbols to us in many ways. I don't know what my car says about me, but actually, it's pretty accurate. But now, with that kind of future that Forbes imagines could happen, transportation is not something that you own. Transportation is a service that you pay for, like your phone bill or your electricity. It's a disruptive technology in that it has massive repercussions on the oil industry, massive repercussions on manufacturing, transportation. You no longer have parking garages anymore. If self-driving electric vehicles help us to get out of Jags games faster, I think we'll all be thankful for that. But roads would change, signage would change. Basically, our way of doing life would change in that kind of future. That's not merely innovating where your car is slightly better than a car that was made 5 years ago. That changes everything. It changes globally all sorts of businesses and companies and individuals. The potential for that kind of disruption is sometimes unsettling to us. When we think about the future and what we think about the future might hold and how it might completely change our way of doing things, or it might completely change our way of life, that can be unsettling to us. And the name of our series, which you can see on the graphic behind me, is Upside Down. And that series title is taken from the chapter of Acts that we're going to be looking at today, Acts chapter 17. It's an accusation that was lobbed at Paul and Silas as they traveled throughout the Roman Empire preaching the good news of what Jesus had done. And it was an accusation that was used against them, but there was an element of truth to that accusation. There was an element of truth to the accusation that the gospel turns things upside down because Jesus is fundamentally disruptive. Jesus is not an innovation that makes one's life a little bit better than it was apart from Jesus. Jesus is not an add-on or an iteration. Jesus and the good news of the gospel is disruptive to people. It is disruptive to cultures. He interrupts and disrupts the lives of people who follow him. And if you don't believe me, ask the Apostle Paul, whose name used to be Saul, who was traveling on a road intent on persecuting Christians when he was knocked off of the donkey that he was traveling on and blinded. Okay, that's not Jesus innovating Saul's life. That's Jesus disrupting his life. Ask Peter, who was a fisherman, content to mind his own business and do his own thing, but when Jesus came and said, "Come, follow me," he fundamentally disrupted and altered Peter's life forever. Ask Stephen, who in his last moments of being lucid is on his knees before a group of people ready to kill him with rocks that they're holding in their hands. That's disruptive. It's disruptive to economies as well. Ask the owners of the fortune-telling slave girl in Philippi who have that revenue stream dried up in a moment. Ask the people of Ephesus in Acts chapter 19 when the idol-making industry that surrounds the worship of the temple of Diana is suddenly takes a major hit. There's rioting in the city. The gospel impacts the world in such a way that it often seems to turn it upside down. And that's exactly what Jesus does. We've been following our missionary team through their second campaign, their second missionary journey. They have pushed into what we often refer to now as modern-day Europe. And when we last saw them, they were being shown the door at Philippi. Things had not gone well in Philippi from a human perspective. The city officials in Philippi did not want them to be there. They had beaten them, thrown them in jail. Paul had demanded a public apology from them, which he was given, but they still asked Paul and Silas to leave the city. And so now in Acts chapter 17, we're going to see them in 3 different Greek cities. And we're going to move as quickly as we can through the first 2 cities so that we can spend the majority of our time this week and next week talking about their visit to that 3rd Greek city. The first one is Thessalonica, and that is found in verses 1 through 9. Verse 2 of Acts chapter 17 tells us that as was their custom, Paul and Silas first went to the synagogue because Paul's stated evangelistic strategy was to the Jew first and also to the Greek, to the non-Jew. So Paul and Silas would often go to the synagogue and talk about the person and work of Jesus to the Jewish people who were there. Verse 2 tells us that they reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead. And then he tells them that the Jesus he proclaims to them is that Christ. Christ is another term for a Messiah, someone who has been sent. You see, the Jews had a messianic expectation They had hundreds of years of prophecy promising that one would come, a Christ, a Messiah, who would fully and finally rescue his people from their sin. So Paul proclaims to them that Christ is Jesus who has come. And the Bible tells us that there were some Jews who heard him who were persuaded, as were some devout Greeks, and not a few leading women of the city. But the larger Jewish population in the city, the Bible tells us, was jealous about this development. And so they incite some rabble-rousers, if you will, to start a riot. So all these people grab their pitchforks and their torches, and they make their way over to a man named Jason's house, where they have heard that Paul and Silas are staying. And Jason has the misfortune of being at home when they arrive, and Paul and Silas are not. And the crowd is worked up now. We got the mob going. We got the riot going. We got to do something. They seize Jason, pull him out of his house, and bring him before the city authorities. And they've got some accusations that they are going to make against him for harboring these individuals. Their accusation is found in verse 6. These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. Now, the first part of their accusation is that they are disturbing the peace. And I want you to note the irony of that accusation, because look at verse 5. It tells us in verse 5 that they have incited a mob to set the city in an uproar. And that mob, which has set the city in an uproar, brings this poor guy, Jason, who's lending his house to this ministry. These are the people that are disturbing the peace. Okay, this is the height of hypocrisy. But the second part of the accusation that they bring in verse 7 is even more serious. It says they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. Now let me tell you, I could do some preaching about that phrase. There is another king, Jesus. They were right. Christians are people who are appropriately patriotic, but never surrender their ultimate allegiance. Our ultimate allegiance is not to our government here. It is not to this country. Our ultimate allegiance is to a king whose authority supersedes all other authorities. Our ultimate allegiance is not to this soil, but to a better country, a city, Hebrews says, whose builder and maker is God. So there was part of that accusation that was true, but they were using something that was technically true, the fact that Christians recognize another king, to act as if Christians were promoting sedition. To act as if Christians were suggesting that people go against the authority of Caesar. This accusation was disturbing enough to the city officials that they allowed Jason to post bail. They let him go, but the Christians who are in the city realize that they're going to need to send Paul out of there to make sure that he does not get into any further trouble. Things were not safe there in Thessalonica. And so they send them away by night to the second Greek city of our chapter, which is the city of Berea. And Berea was different than Thessalonica. Berea was different from Thessalonica because of the way that Paul and Silas and his missionary team had been received at their previous two stops. In Philippi, things have become dangerous quickly. They've been beaten. In Thessalonica, a riot goes to a house to bring them forcibly before the city authorities. Berea is different. Once again, Paul and Silas go to the synagogue to preach Jesus to the people who are there, but there's something different about the Jews who are here in this synagogue. It says they were more noble. And when the Bible says that the Jews in this synagogue were more noble, it means that they were more open-minded than previous audiences that Paul and Silas had spoken to. They were willing to stop for a moment and actually see that what Paul was bringing to their attention was not some new thing, but something that was in line with the teaching of the entirety of the Old Testament. It was in line with and coordinated with and harmonious with Jewish expectation for millennia. And once again, Luke, the author of Acts, tells us that there were many people who believed, and not a few Greek women of high standing put their faith in Jesus. But the jealous Jews in Thessalonica were not content to simply drive Paul and Silas out of their own city. They actually pursue Paul and Silas and the missionary team 45 miles to Berea, which is no small journey. They pursue them and they begin persecuting them there. They spread lies about them there. They try to incite people there. It says that they are agitating and stirring up the crowds. And so the Christians in Berea immediately send Paul off. They send him to the sea. And what we assume is that Paul, as he goes to Athens next, travels that 195 journey by sea because it was difficult to make that trip by land because of Mount Olympus that got in the way. When Paul arrives in Athens, he sends for Silas and Timothy to come to him. But we're going to see that he does not let the grass grow under his feet while he's there. He immediately engages in ministry. Look with me now at verse 16 of Acts chapter 17. The Word of God says this, "Now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And some said, 'What does this babbler wish to say?' Others said, 'He seems to be preaching of foreign divinities,' because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, 'May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean.' Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new." Athens had a lot to offer. Athens has been described as the intellectual capital of the Greek world. Athens was in many ways past its prime, but it was still a city that was known by its intellectual pursuits. It was known for its architecture. It was known for its theater. It was known for its food. It was a city that had everything that you could imagine. It was a city that had so much to offer, but Paul saw that city through a different lens. When he walked through this magnificent city and he saw the many things that the city had to offer, he was inwardly provoked that the city was full of idols. And that word provoke that Luke uses to describe the feeling that Paul got as he walked around is the same word that is used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament to describe God when he is provoked by the idolatry of his people. It is worship given to what is worthless. Worship is something that we ought to reserve only for that which is of greatest worth. And yet these people are worshiping that which is worthless. Athens was a monument to the accomplishments of mankind in almost every way. And you can still visit Athens to this day and see the glory of what mankind can accomplish. You can see the ruins of the Parthenon. You can see the ruins of the Acropolis. You can see these magnificent temples that still stand there. Greek philosophy and thought is still studied in universities today. Yet Paul looks around at this magnificent city and sees that it is a city permeated by a deep and abiding spiritual darkness. And so Paul did what Paul did. He went to the synagogue, reasoned with the Jews. But Luke also tells us that he would go to the marketplace every day and he would just have conversations with anybody who would listen. The Bible tells us that there were people there that represented different philosophical schools of thought. He conversed with both Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. The Epicureans were what Darrell Bach calls agnostic secularists. They were people who did not believe that the existence of God could be either proven or disproven, and that one did not need to build a system of morality using the materials or the wishes of a deity. We're perfectly fine coming up with moral standards and norms without any idea of God. Thank you very much. Philosopher Diogenes had summarized their viewpoint this way one time. Nothing to fear in God, nothing to feel in death. Good can be attained, evil can be endured. That was the philosophical perspective of the Epicureans. The Stoics, on the other hand, were pantheists. They believed that everything was God, that God was the sum total of reality and the principles that drive reality. God is not a person, but God is in everything and through everything, and we're all connected as God. There were two main reactions to Paul's teaching. One of the reactions was just straight up skepticism. They refer to Paul as a babbler. And when they refer to Paul as a babbler, they're using a term that was used literally to describe a bird that would go around picking up seeds. So as these birds would scavenge the area that they were in, they would pick up random seeds here and there, and it became to be used figuratively to describe a person who would go around and pick up different pieces of philosophy here and there that he didn't really understand or fully comprehend, and combine them all together and then speak as if he was aware of something, as if he was a teacher or really knew something. That's the way that they characterize Paul when they call him a babbler. There's a bit of intellectual snobbery going on here, isn't there? Intellectual snobbery that continues well into this day. The other reaction was curiosity. Some thought that he was preaching foreign divinities because he's talking about some person named Jesus and a resurrection, and this is strange to their ears. You bring strange things to us. And because Paul was teaching strange things, some of them wanted to know more. And as an aside, in verse 21, Luke, the author, inserts this little editorial remark that the Athenians would often spend their days doing nothing more than telling or hearing something new. And what he's telling us when he tells us that the Athenians were characterized this way is that the Athenians were interested in the pursuit of ideas. He's not telling us that they're interested in the pursuit of truth, but that they loved hearing a new outlook on the world, new ideas to be explored. So they bring him to the Areopagus. The Areopagus is marked now in Athens only by a plaque that's near the Acropolis. But it was a public place where crimes were tried, philosophical talks were given, ideas were exchanged, things that mattered to the life of the city were discussed. And Paul is actually invited to the Areopagus to share these strange things with them. And in doing that, he provides for us what I think is a helpful model of engaging culture. You see, we're talking about a culture filled with Epicureans and Stoics and philosophy, a culture that's 2,000 years removed from our culture, and yet I'd like to suggest that the culture in Athens is not that far removed from our culture today. The particulars are different. Today's public square of ideas is not inhabited by Epicureans or Stoics. Probably. Your neighbor is probably not carefully mowing his lawn around a shrine, unless his college football team's flag is there. But we'll leave that discussion for another day. But we do live like the people of Athens lived, we live in what you could refer to as a pluralistic society. And here's what I mean by a pluralistic society. We live in a society where there is not much of a common shared worldview about the nature of reality. It used to be a time when we were all working with the same basic premises about reality. But we live in a pluralistic culture in which you are very likely to encounter, if you leave your home, a wide variety of competing and contradictory viewpoints on the nature of what is and why it is. This pluralistic culture means that there are multiple and competing different beliefs and worldviews. That, in and of itself, is nothing to be particularly distressed about. In fact, our country is built, thankfully, on allowing a multiplicity of beliefs, competing beliefs, and worldviews. But our culture is also becoming increasingly committed to pluralism as an ideology. And let me explain to you what I mean by pluralism as an ideology. When we're talking about pluralism as an ideology, we are not simply acknowledging the existence of competing contradictory belief systems and worldviews. Pluralism as an ideology affirms the equal validity of all of these competing beliefs and worldviews. In other words, we have all kinds of people saying completely contradictory things about the way things are, and our assumption is not that we should try to figure out who's right. Our assumption is that all of those are in some way equally valid. And in that case, a culture that is committed to pluralism is a culture that is not necessarily committed to truth with a capital T. We're committed to true as long as it works for you. True as long as it provides some sort of structure to your life. True as if it helps you sleep at night. But we are no longer a culture of people looking or even believing that it's possible to find the truth. Well, that's Athens. And this isn't just the perspective of some university professor in a corduroy jacket. This is the perspective of your neighbor with a coexist bumper sticker. The coexist bumper sticker isn't saying, let's just all get along, because we can all agree with that. Your neighbor with a coexist bumper sticker, if he or she has thought about it, is saying, let's not only all get along, but we're all right anyway. What does it matter? And me thinking that one thing is true and one thing is false is the very seeds of disunity. The only way we can be unified as a people and one is if we all believe that whatever you think is true. It's the perspective at the girl at the gas pump next to you. She's probably not an Epicurean, but she probably thinks John Lennon's Imagine is a beautiful song. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Perhaps Athens, Greece, and Athens, Georgia aren't that different after all. The way Paul engages them can be instructive to us. And what Paul does here in his talk at the Areopagus is helpfully model how to faithfully preach the gospel to a pluralistic culture. This is not the only way to preach the gospel to a pluralistic culture, but it's a helpful template. It's an instructive template to help us preach Jesus and the resurrection, what our increasingly post-Christian culture thinks of as strange things. There are three assertions that Paul establishes in his Areopagus address. We're going to look at the first one this morning, and don't worry, we're not going to look at all three of them because I'm really going, okay? So this is going to push into next week, and you're going to get to eat your lunch in a reasonable amount of time, I think. We're going to look at the first assertion that Paul makes. We're asking the question, how do we preach the gospel faithfully to a pluralistic culture? Here's the first thing that Paul does and which we must do. Number one, establish a proper understanding of God. Establish a proper understanding of God. Look at Acts chapter 17, beginning in verse 22. Acts chapter 17 and verse 22 says, "So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, 'Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything.'" So Paul begins his speech to the folks at the Areopagus by noting that they are quite religious. He tells them that as he has been exploring their great city, he has seen that there are objects of worship everywhere. And in this religious soup, he finds an altar with an interesting prescription. It is to an unknown God. That altar is basically making sure your bases are covered. There are altars to Themis, Apollo, Hermes, Zeus, Athena. And then in case we've missed anyone, he or she has an altar that we can easily write in the inscription of whoever it is that we've missed. Paul is not so much paying them a compliment about their piety as he is drawing on a widely shared assumption that the Athenians were religious and even a bit superstitious. And he pulls something from their culture that they would have been immediately familiar with and then uses that to proclaim what he regards as the one true God to them. He's going to establish 3 facts about God that he wants them to know. These are not the only important facts about God, but these are the 3 that he chooses when he wants to establish a proper understanding of God. Because what we can say for certain is that none of the people he is speaking to is working with a shared understanding of God. Just like the people we're often speaking to are not working with a shared understanding of God. And here's the first thing that he wants to communicate to them. He wants to communicate, first of all, that God is the comprehensive creator. He's the creator of the world and everything in it. Contrary to the Stoics, God is a personal being. God is not a life force. God is not in everything and through. We're not all connected, all part of the one total reality that is God. God is a personal and thus knowable being. He is the creator of the world and yet distinct from the world. He is in the second place, not only the comprehensive creator, but he is the absolute authority. That's what Paul means when he says that he is the Lord of heaven and earth. He is proclaiming to them that this creator God is completely, sovereignly, wholly, and totally in charge. Now that may not be abundantly visible in a world that seems to be spinning out of control, but Paul wants them to know that the same God who created everything that exists is the absolute authority over what exists. He is ruling it. God did not wind up the creation when he was bored one night and then walk away to bigger and better things and leave us on our own muddling through. He continues to rule sovereignly over it, and Paul is going to return to that point in verse 31 when he says there is coming a day of judgment when he will judge the world through his son, Jesus. You see, God can do that because he's in charge, because he made it. But that leads us to a third truth about God. If we're establishing the identity of God, he is not only the comprehensive creator, he is not only the absolute authority, but he is in the third place the self-sufficient sustainer. The self-sufficient sustainer. By virtue of the fact that he made everything and rules everything, he does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. This is a bold statement of self-sufficiency. You and I don't know what it is to exist apart from need. There has never been a moment in your existence that need has not tugged at you. You need the most basic things to continue living another moment. You need to breathe. And if you don't breathe within a very short amount of time, life is over. Your heart needs to beat. And you are frankly not in control of that. You cannot command your heart to beat. It does until it doesn't. God has no needs. There has never been a millisecond in his eternal existence where the words "I need" have ever escaped his spiritual lips. God has never experienced a time of lack. God has always been self-sufficient. Even the most powerful king or dictator that you can imagine needs his people, doesn't he? That king or dictator may have absolute authority. He may be able to summon a person into his presence and immediately dispatch them to be executed. He may have that kind of authority. And there are kings and dictators on the stage of world history that have been able to do that with hundreds of thousands of people in their kingdoms. Absolute authority, no one can tell them no, but those kings still exist to some degree in a codependent relationship with their subjects. Do you know why? They need revenue. They need an army. They need people to do foreign diplomacy. They need a continual stream of riches coming to their table. They need all kinds of things, and though they may have absolute power, they are very much served by human hands. And as much as they may look down on their subjects, they need those subjects. Even the most powerful dictator in the world is dependent on human hands and dependent on God for something as basic as his next heartbeat or his next breath. But the God Paul proclaims to the Athenians is in a separate category. He does not exist in a codependent relationship with his creation. He is utterly and completely and perfectly self-sufficient. He does not need a temple. He does not need our sacrifices. He does not need our shrines. He does not need anything that these hands can give him. On the contrary, it is he who is the giver of everything we have. Every good thing in your life, you may have worked for it, you may have bought it, you may have done whatever to get it, but every good thing in your life comes from the self-sufficient God. And you continue to be dependent on him for your next heartbeat. Evangelism in a post-Christian, pluralistic context often requires laying more evangelistic groundwork than was necessary before. When Paul could go into a synagogue, he could speak to people who had a whole complex of ideas that were shared with him about the nature of reality and who God was. He could go straight to Jesus. But when Paul speaks to the Athenians, he has to define something as simple as the term God, because there are many competing definitions of what that is. God is not an impersonal force. God is not the circle of life. God is not the sum total of everything. God is not an unknowable or unverifiable being. God is the knowable, personal creator, sustainer, and ruler of the world that he created. It is of vital importance that we and other people know who God is. And here's just one example of why. We wonder sometimes why the world that we live in is so hopeless. We wonder why things like a suicide rate could be as high as it is. We wonder why thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans struggle with depression. We wonder, as we hear the news, why human life could matter so little. How somebody could leave a baby in the trash. How someone could abuse or neglect a child. But if people have a lifetime of being told that they are the random product of time and chance, they're going to start living like it. If I have been vomited from the belly of an unthinking, unfeeling universe that mysteriously and accidentally sparked itself into existence, then why would any of us have hope? If you and I are highly evolved accidents, then why does any of it matter? Why would any life be that important? Maybe we're all just playing. Maybe we just need to fill these brief, accidental, pointless lives with as much pleasure as we can until it's gone. If this is all there is, then I better get mine for as long as I can get it. If God only wound up the creation when he was bored one night, then who is he to tell me what to do? You see, if we're going to preach the gospel faithfully to a pluralistic culture, then we are going to have to provide some definition about who God is, because our culture and every other culture that has ever existed desperately needs to hear it. Preaching to a culture committed to the ideology of pluralism that we demands that we define God to others the way he has revealed himself to us for his glory and our joy. You see, we were created for worship, and we are going to worship. And we are either going to worship the shrines of unimportant things around us, or we are going to redirect our gaze to that which is most beautiful in this universe. We are going to direct our gaze to that which is our greatest treasure. And God promises that in doing so, it is not just watch me flex my muscles and know how self-sufficient I am and how I don't need you. God created you, and he knows that if you will seek pleasure in him, if you'll seek glory in him, that will be for your joy. It is not an alternative to joy. It is the very source and fount of joy. And we're going to continue this next week. But I have a plaque hanging in my office with this quote from Francis Schaeffer, and it's this: Christianity provides a unified answer for the whole of life. And I believe that. I believe that's an accurate representation of what the Scriptures call us to. The Scriptures do not call us to a truth to get by. They make the staggering claim of calling us to the truth. A claim that many of us continually stumble over. Because it's hard to believe that there is such a thing as the truth. But the truth, this God who has revealed himself to us in many ways, who is this personal creator and ruler of the universe, has revealed himself in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And that means good news for us. It means good news for us because it means that this death march that we are on in this world can end in resurrection. And it ends in resurrection because God, the personal, knowable God, does not stand apart from the universe and watch it burn. He freely and willingly enters into it in the person of his Son, who he sent to die. And then he gives us the good news that Paul proclaimed to the Athenians. The God that you don't know, the God that you couldn't define, this is the true God. What kind of God would send his Son to do that for you? For you. The one who has no needs would send a Son to thirst and breathe and hurt and die. But the good news of the gospel is that this Son who did all of these things rose. And those may be strange things to the Athenians, and they may be strange things to modern hearers, but Jesus rose. And because Jesus rose from the dead, the world stage has been fundamentally disrupted and altered ever since. Jesus truly did turn the world upside down. And he can do that on a macro level, on a micro level in your heart and in your life if you come to him in faith today. So I call you to that. If you want to talk more about that or understand that better, if you have questions, we'd love to talk with you more about that. But let's take time now before we respond in song to pray, to thank God for revealing himself to us the way he has.